12 minutes late, it doesn't sound like much, but that night, 12 minutes was the distance between a name no one remembers and a name no one is allowed to forget. A hand closed hard around her shoulder, the hand of a man she'd never once seen sweat in 3 months. Now he was shaking. Table 7. Do not screw this up. 6 men. 5 pairs of eyes passed over her like she was a lamp. One did not. In her apron pocket, the phone buzzed. The phone she should never have answered. She lifted it to her ear, breathed a single word, in a language all 6 of those men were certain she couldn't understand. 12 minutes late, that doesn't sound like much. Not out loud. Not to a man who has never stood in the cold with his whole life balanced on the edge of a paycheck. But to Ginevra Fioravanti, 12 minutes was a country. 12 minutes was the distance between having a job and not having one, between rent paid and rent late, between invisible and noticed. And noticed, in her experience, was where the trouble always started. She ran the last 2 blocks. The winter had come hard to Chicago that year. The kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin but works its way underneath it. That finds the worn seams of a coat you've owned 3 winters too long. That comes off Lake Michigan with a sound like something hungry and takes whatever it wants and gives nothing back. Her fingers had gone numb around the 3rd block. Her nose burned red. Her breath came out in ragged white clouds that the wind tore apart before they could even form. And her hair. God, her hair. 20 minutes she'd spent on it that morning. 20 careful minutes with a curling iron that only worked if you held it just so, standing in a bathroom the size of a closet, telling herself that today she would look put together. Today she would look like a woman who had her life in order. And now it hung around her face in wet, defeated strands, the curls beaten flat, and she thought with the small bitter humor of someone too tired to cry, of course. Of course it does. She hit the service door with her shoulder and shoved through. Heat swallowed her whole. Steam. The clang of copper pans. The roar of a kitchen at full tilt, and the smell garlic and butter and seared meat, and something with wine reducing down to almost nothing. The smell of money. The smell of a world she served but did not belong to. For 1 second she just stood there in it, letting the warmth needle back into her frozen hands, letting her body remember it was alive. 1 second. That was all she got. Ginevra. The voice cut through the noise, sharp. High wrong. She turned and found Paolo bearing down on her. Paolo, the floor manager. A man she had watched handle a grease fire in a fainting diner and a table of drunk executives on the same night without so much as loosening his tie. A man made of composure. A man she had never, not once in 3 months, seen sweat. He was sweating now. Where have you been? The train, it was. Table 7. His hands closed on her shoulders. Not gentle. His fingers dug into the muscle there, hard enough that she felt it through her coat. You're serving table 7 tonight. She blinked at him, trying to catch up. That's Paolo. That's Renata's section. Renata went home 2 hours ago. Sick, his eyes flicked to the kitchen doors, then back to her face, and there was something in them she'd never seen before. Something close to fear. Listen to me. Listen. These people at table 7, they are important. Do you understand the word I'm using? Important, Paolo. You're scaring me. Good, he said it without a trace of apology. Be scared. Fear will keep you sharp. Just whatever you do tonight, do not screw up. And then he was gone. Swallowed back into the chaos of the kitchen, leaving her standing there with her apron half tied, and her heart doing something strange fast behind her ribs. She finished the knot with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, smoothed the front of her black skirt, tucked the wet strands of hair back behind her ears, one side then the other, a small ritual of composure. Breathe, she told herself. You've done 1,000 tables. Important men still eat with forks. They still spill wine. They still need someone to bring them bread. That's all this is, except a part of her knew it wasn't. The same part that had learned, a long time ago, to read a room before she stepped into it, to feel the temperature of a man's mood from across a space, to know, the way an animal knows, when something is off. 6 months. That was how long she'd been in this city. 6 months since she'd crossed to this side of her own life and left the other half behind the half, with a man who had started with soft words, with flowers, with I've never felt this way about anyone, and ended somewhere very different. Somewhere with raised voices and slammed doors, somewhere with hands. She still checked the mirror for the marks out of habit. Even now. Even when there was nothing left to find, When the last of them had faded months ago, her eyes still went to her own wrists, her own throat, the way a tongue goes to the gap where a tooth used to be. Before Chicago, there had been years of it. Years of making herself smaller and smaller, learning the exact shape of the space between his moods, learning to move through her own home like a ghost, so as not to wake the thing that lived in him. And when she had finally run one suitcase, a fold of cash, a bus ticket bought with cash so there'd be no card to trace, she had made herself one promise. Standing in the station at 4 in the morning with her heart in her throat, she had promised herself. Invisible. Invisible was safe. Invisible was a woman nobody looked at twice. A woman with no story worth telling. A waitress in a good restaurant who kept her head down, did her work, sent money home to her grandmother, and asked the world for nothing except to be left alone. That was the whole plan. That was the entire architecture of the life she'd built. And tonight, 12 minutes late and soaked to the bone, she had no idea it was about to come apart. She caught a passing busboy by the sleeve. A kid, 17 maybe, arms full of dirty plates, table 7, she said. Who are they? He didn't slow down. But he answered 2 words, and he dropped his voice when he said them, the way you lower your voice in church, Ravena's people. And the floor seemed to drop an inch beneath her feet, because everyone who worked at Ambrosia knew the name Ravena. It was the name on the deed, the name that signed the checks, the name of the owner nobody ever actually saw. He was a rumor more than a man, a shape at the edge of things. His name got passed around in the walk-in freezer during smoke breaks, when the managers were out of earshot, always in that same lowered tone. Some said he was just rich, a businessman with more restaurants than one man could keep track of. Others said different things, darker things, things about warehouses down by the water, about shipments that came in at 3 in the morning, about money that went in dirty and came out clean. She'd never seen him. In 3 months, she'd never once wanted to. Private room, the busboy called over his shoulder, already halfway to the dish pit. In the back. Of course it was. She stood there for one more moment, breathed in, held it until her lungs began to ache. Let it out slow, the way her grandmother had taught her to, when she was a frightened child piano. Cure mio, slowly, the fear cannot live in a slow breath. And then she pushed through the double doors into the dining room. Ambrosia glowed the way it always did. That was the word for it, the only word it glowed. Warm light, spilling off crystal and catching in the wine. White cloth over dark wood. Old paintings in heavy frames. Waiters moving through it like a choreography, silent and smooth. It was the kind of wealth that never had to raise its voice, because it had never once in its life been ignored. She crossed it the way she'd been trained to. Spine straight, chin level, eyes soft and unfocused, taking in everything and settling on nothing. A ghost in a black apron, gliding between the tables of the living, down the main floor, past the wine room with its temperature-controlled glass, down a short hall toward the back where the noise of the restaurant fell away and the light dimmed and the private room waited behind a heavy wooden door. She stopped in front of it. Her heart was very loud now. She raised her hand, knocked once, soft, and she went in. The private room was darker than the rest of the restaurant. Where the dining room glowed, this place smoldered gold light, low and close, pooling on the table and leaving the corners in shadow. There was a round table in the center of it, and around that table, 6 men in suits that cost more than she earned in a year. Maybe 2 years, maybe more than she'd earn in 5. If you counted the watches, they were talking, they stopped. 6 pairs of eyes came up and turned toward the door. Toward her. She had walked into 100 rooms like this. She knew how to be looked at and not be seen, how to make herself the furniture, the hand that sets down the plate, the presence you forget the instant it leaves. She had built a whole life on that skill. But this room was different, because 5 of those pairs of eyes flicked over her the way you'd glance at a lamp, at a door, at anything that moves and then proves unimportant. 5 of them dismissed her in the space of a breath, and one did not. He sat at what was unmistakably the head of the table, which made no sense, which she noticed even in that first disoriented second, some small stubborn part of her mind insisting on it because it was a round table. A round table has no head. That's the entire point of a round table. And yet there he was, at the head of it, and the geometry of the room simply rearranged itself around that fact. He was the point everything else pointed at. The still center, the whole room turned around without knowing it. Dark hair, swept back, perfect. A jaw shadowed with stubble that was too even, too deliberate, to be anything but maintained. And a suit, she noticed the suit the way you notice weather. A suit that hadn't been fitted to him so much as grown on him. Like the fabric had never existed before it found his shoulders. Like it would never sit right on any other living man. But it was the eyes that stopped her, dark. Very dark. And sharp in a way that had nothing to do with intelligence, though there was that too. Sharp the way a blade is sharp, and cold. That was the thing she felt before she could name it, the cold. A specific temperature she knew from the inside out, because she had lived years of her life next to it. The cold of a man who watches and calculates and decides, and does not warm to what he sees unless it serves him to. The kind of cold she had run from once already. She dropped her gaze, fast, down to her order pad, to the safe blank of it, and felt the heat crawl up the side of her neck, a flush she couldn't stop, and hated herself for it. Because a flush is a tell, and you never give a man like that a tell. Good evening, gentlemen. Her voice came out steady, and she had no idea where the steadiness came from. My name is Ginevra. I'll be looking after you tonight. Can I start anyone with something to drink? She worked her way around the table. Clockwise, efficient, a name repeated, an order noted, a small nod. She was good at this, genuinely good. The kind of good that comes from years of paying very close attention to what powerful people want before they've finished asking for it. And the whole time, moving from man to man, she was aware of the one gaze that never left her. It tracked her around the table like the needle of a compass following north. She saved him for last. She didn't mean to. Or maybe she did. Maybe some instinct told her to keep him at the far edge of the room as long as she could, pen ready, eyes carefully on her pad. And when she reached his side and opened her mouth to ask, he didn't answer the question she was about to ask. You're new, he said instead. Not a question, a statement, laid down flat and certain. His voice was low and unhurried and smooth as the surface of still water, and under it ran an accent she couldn't place. Not quite Italian. Not quite American. Something that had lived in both places long enough to belong fully to neither. Yes, sir. She kept her voice even. 3 months. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The idea of one. The place where a smile would go on a man who had them. Scotch, he said. Neat, she wrote it down, nodded, turned to go, and the door opened behind her. A man came in, broad, black-suited, the kind of build that fills a doorway. He crossed the room without a glance at anyone, went straight to the head of the table, bent low, and murmured something into the dark-haired man's ear. Just a few words. Ginevra was close enough to hear the sound of them, but not the meaning. The dark-haired man's face did not change. Not a muscle of it moved, but his shoulders did. Something settled across them, a new weight, a new tension, a shift she felt more than saw. Like a man who has just been told a number he doesn't like, and is deciding in real time what he's going to do about it. She slipped out, into the hall, and only when the door had shut behind her did she let herself breathe, because something in that room made the air feel thin. Something about that man made her lungs work harder than they should. And she stood there for a moment in the dim hallway with one hand flat against the wall, telling herself she was being ridiculous, that he was just another rich man at another table, that in 2 hours he'd be gone and she'd never think of him again. She placed the drinks at the bar and waited, watching the bartender's hands, thinking about nothing, thinking about her grandmother, thinking about the phone in her apron that hadn't rung. When she came back with the loaded tray, the room had changed. The voices were lower now, the faces harder. Papers had appeared on the table folders, documents, a pen passed from hand to hand. She moved among them, setting down glasses like she wasn't there, which was, after all, the thing she did best. She set the scotch in front of the dark-haired man, and her phone buzzed against her hip. She never took calls on the floor, never. In 3 months she had never once broken that rule, except this week. This one terrible week, because in a hospice bed in Florence, an ocean away, her grandmother was dying, and Ginevra had made herself a promise she intended to keep, that she would not let the woman who had raised her die alone, with no warning, no chance for goodbye, while her granddaughter was carrying plates. So the phone stayed on, in her apron, against her body, waiting for the call she was dreading with her whole heart and could not afford to miss. She stepped back against the wall, into the shadow at the edge of the gold light. She slid the phone up just far enough to see the screen. The nurse's number. Her heart lurched sideways, a physical thing, like missing a step in the dark. She glanced at the table, heads down, deep in whatever the papers were. Nobody watching her, or so she thought. 2 steps toward the door, and she answered, turning her body away, cupping the phone to her mouth. "Pronto," she whispered. The Italian slipped out on its own. It always did. It was the language underneath her, the one her mind reached for when it stopped translating and simply spoke. The language of home, of a kitchen in the hills outside Florence, of rosemary crushed between old fingers, of warm bread and a low voice singing something wordless while it worked. The language of the hands that had raised her when the world had taken everyone else away. The nurse spoke, softly, carefully, with the particular gentleness of someone who has delivered this kind of news many times and has never once gotten used to it. Ginevra closed her eyes. Her free hand curled slowly into a fist at her side, the nails biting her palm, a small pain to hold on to. She said a few words back, quiet ones, Italian ones, si capisco, grazy, quiet as a prayer, and she ended the call. She blinked hard. Once, twice, pushing it back, all of it, down below the surface where it couldn't show. And when she opened her eyes, the room was silent. Every man at the table had turned to look at her. And she understood in a slow and sinking wave of horror exactly what she had just done. She had spoken Italian, fluent, fast, native, in front of 6 men who had spent the last 2 hours speaking it freely to each other, believing, as men like that always believe of the help, that the waitress could not understand a single word. She fumbled the phone back down into her apron. "I'm so sorry." For the interruption, her voice cracked on the last word, and she despised it, that crack, that tell. "Can I bring anyone anything?" Most of them looked away, went back to their papers, their glasses, the small business of forgetting her. He didn't. The dark-haired man was watching her now with a completely different quality of attention. His head had tilted, just slightly, to one side, and she recognized the look because she had spent her whole life reading men's faces. For exactly this, the moment a thing stops being scenery and starts being information. She had walked into that room as furniture. She was walking back out of it as a puzzle, and she did not like, not at all, the way that felt. The dinner went on and on and on. Each course was a small eternity, the antipasti, the primi, the fish, the meat, the cheese, the espresso, and through every one of them she moved in and out of that gold-lit room carrying plates, refilling glasses, clearing away, and every single time she crossed the threshold she felt his eyes find her. It wasn't lewd. That was almost the strange part. She knew lewd. She'd been serving tables long enough to know the exact weight of a man's eyes crawling down her back. And this wasn't that. This was worse in a way. This was a man turning her over in his mind like a coin he'd found in the street, wondering where it came from, what it was worth, whether it was real. Once, leaning between 2 of the guests to set down a plate, she passed close behind his chair and caught the drift of his cologne. Something woody, dark, expensive in a way that announced nothing and cost everything. Something that absurdly, she found herself thinking, smelled like power itself. Like the idea of power had been distilled and bottled, and touched at the pulse of a man who had more of it than anyone she'd ever stood this close to. She filed the thought away, embarrassed by it, and kept moving. By the time the espresso came, the conversation had loosened. The business was done, the papers back in their folders, and the men had drifted into the easier talk of powerful people, at rest a shipping schedule, a mutual acquaintance, a football match, a joke she was glad she didn't fully catch. Some of it in English, most of it in Italian. And Ginevra, standing at the wall waiting to be needed, understood every word. She kept her face a careful blank, because that was the job. Because invisible was safe. Because a woman who let it show that she understood too much in a room like this was a woman who had just made herself a problem. And problems, in her experience, got handled. So she let it all wash over her and gave back nothing. Not a flicker. Not the twitch of a suppressed smile at the joke. Nothing. Near midnight they finally rose. She brought the check in its leather folder and set it at the head of the table. He didn't so much as glance at the total. He simply drew a black card from inside his jacket and held it out, and she took it, and ran it and brought back the slip. He signed it with a fast, unreadable flourish, and when he held it out to her, and she reached to take it, His fingers didn't let go right away. They stayed, just for a beat, just long enough that it couldn't have been an accident. you.Genevra, he said her name. In perfect Italian, the vowels round and easy, the stress in exactly the right place. He said it like he'd known it a long time. Like it belonged to him somehow, now that he'd said it. She nodded, because she did not trust her voice, and stepped back. They filed out one by one. He was the last. At the door, he paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her across the ruined table. Buonanotte, he said, and then he was gone. She let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding, a long one, and felt her shoulders come down from around her ears. The tip, when she clearing the table, was obscene. Folded under the edge of a plate. More than a week of her wages, sitting there in crisp bills like it was nothing, like it was a gesture that cost him no thought at all. She folded it into her apron pocket with fingers that had started shaking again, and could not have told you why. Why the whole evening had left her feeling the way you feel after a near miss on the highway, the danger already past, the car already gone, and your body only now understanding that something could have happened, that something almost did. An hour later she was finally done. The last of the guests long gone, the dining room dark, only the closing crew left rattling around the kitchen. She untied her apron in the back hall, bone-tired, and under the tiredness, in the place she'd been holding it down all night, the grief was waiting for her. Patient. Enormous. Because her grandmother was dying an ocean away, and she needed to be there, needed to hold that frail hand one last time, and flights to Italy cost money she did not have. Even with tonight's tip. She'd done the math 3 times in her head between courses. Even with tonight's obscene tip, she wasn't sure she could get there in time. Ginevra, she startled. Paolo was standing right beside her. She hadn't heard him come. Mr. Ravena would like a word with you before you go. The floor dropped out of her stomach. Mr. Ravena, she repeated. He's here? Paolo gave her a look she couldn't read. Something between confusion and warning. Of course he's here. He was at table 7, the room tilted very slightly, and righted itself, the dark-haired man. The one at the head of a table that had no head. The one whose eyes had followed her all night. The one who had watched her come apart against the wall with a phone pressed to her ear. That was Dario Ravena, the owner. The rumor, the name in the freezer. The name that got said in a lowered voice. Paolo walked her back through the empty kitchen, past the cooling ovens and the stacked chairs, to a small office at the very back that she had never seen the inside of in 3 months of working there. He knocked once, waited, pushed the door open and stood aside to let her pass. Her legs had gone to water. She made them carry her anyway. The office was small and close. All dark wood, most of it taken up by a heavy desk. A single lamp burned on that desk, and its light fell across his face at a low angle, carving it into planes, and shadows the sharp line of the cheekbone, the shadow beneath it, the hard edge of the jaw. He had taken off his jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and in the lamplight his forearms were corded and strong, the arms of a man who had not always sat behind a desk. He was not alone. Against the wall by the door stood the broad man from before, the one who had whispered in his ear, feet planted shoulder width, hands folded low in front of him, watching her with the flat, patient attention of a professional. A bodyguard, if she had ever seen one, and she had. Sit, Ginevra, she sat. Her back very straight, not touching the chair. Her hands folded in her lap, one gripping the other to keep them still. Was this it then? Was she being let go? For the phone, for the Italian, for some small unforgivable thing she'd done without even knowing she'd done it. She ran back through the evening, hunting for the mistake, and couldn't find it, and that was almost worse, not knowing what she'd broken. You speak Italian, he said, like a native, no greeting, no preamble. His eyes had not left her face since she came in. She swallowed. I am a native. I grew up outside Florence, and yet your English has no accent. My mother was American. I grew up in both. Between both, he nodded slowly. The way a man nods when he is not learning something new, but confirming something he already suspected. Fitting a piece into a place he'd already prepared for it. The call tonight, he said. Bad news from home. Not a question. Again. He didn't ask her things. He told her the answers and watched her face to see if he was right. Her eyes went wide, just a fraction, at how much he'd taken from so little. My grandmother is very ill, she said. The nurse told me I should come. Soon. If I want to, and there her throat closed on her, tight as a fist, and she could not finish the sentence, could not put the end of it into the air. And to her horror, the tears came, rose up hot and fast. She blinked them back, furious with herself, with her body, with the whole betraying architecture of grief. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of this man, of all the men in the world. Something crossed his face. She watched it go. It wasn't sympathy. She didn't think this was a man well acquainted with sympathy, but it was something in that neighborhood. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. The look of a man who knew what it was to lose the one person who had held you together when you were small. He opened a drawer in the desk, took out a slim black folder, slid it across the wood toward her. Open it. Her fingers hovered over it a moment, then obeyed. Inside was a plane ticket. First class. Chicago to Florence, departing the following afternoon, and beside it a plain envelope, and when she lifted the flap and looked inside, she saw more cash than she had ever seen gathered in one place in her whole life. Bills, thick, banded, an amount that made her stomach drop for the second time that night. She looked up, fear and confusion tangling together in her chest, pulling in different directions. I don't understand. I need someone who speaks native Italian to travel with me, he said. My usual translator is unwell. The trip is 2 weeks. Florence first, then Rome. Business meetings, mostly. The kind where nuance matters and mistakes are expensive. His eyes held hers, steady and unblinking. The ticket is yours. The money is yours. If you agree to work for me during those 2 weeks. Her mind raced, snagging on the edges of it. Too perfect, too convenient, too fast. A dying grandmother in Florence, and here, laid on the desk in front of her, a first-class ticket straight to her. What would the work be? Exactly, she made herself ask. The corner of his mouth curved the same not smile from the table. Translation during meetings. A little correspondence. Nothing beyond your abilities, Ginevra. Nothing you would find distasteful. I give you my word. She stared at the ticket, at the impossible lifeline of it. Florence. Her grandmother. A goodbye. The one thing she wanted in all the world and could not afford, sitting there on a stranger's desk, offered up like it was nothing. But nothing offered like nothing is ever nothing. She knew that. She'd learned that lesson with her body. Why me, she said. And she made herself lift her eyes to his when she said it. There are agencies for this. Professional translators. People with certifications, references. You could hire someone by tomorrow morning without ever leaving this chair. So, why me? Something shifted behind his eyes. Something she didn't like. Something she couldn't read, which was worse. I prefer someone authentic, he said. Someone who understands not just the words, but what lives underneath them. The culture, the tone. What a man means when he says one thing and intends another. A pause. And I prefer someone I've already looked into. The last words landed in the small room like a stone dropped into still water. Looked into. You don't have to decide now, he went on. Easy, unhurried, leaning back in his chair like a man who already knew exactly how this ended and was simply waiting for her to catch up to it. The flight leaves at 3 tomorrow. If you accept, a car will collect you from your apartment at noon. Her blood went cold in her veins. He knew where she lived. How? Employee records, he said, smooth, immediate, readied. But there was something in his face, some faint flicker at the edge of it, that told her that was not the whole of the truth. That employee records were the answer he'd prepared, and behind it was a longer answer he had no intention of giving. She stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. She held the folder to her chest like a shield. I'll think about it, he nodded, once granting it, and as she turned toward the door, he spoke again, quietly to her back. Ginevra, she stopped. Your grandmother doesn't have much time, a beat. And neither, I think, do you. The words hung there in the lamplit air behind her, soft as silk, sharp as anything she'd ever felt. She was halfway home before it truly landed on her. The cab moved through the dark and empty city, the meter ticking. The street lights, sliding across her face in slow yellow bars. And she sat in the back replaying the conversation, and somewhere around the third replay, the thing she had missed came up out of the water and showed itself. He hadn't asked if she had a passport. He hadn't asked if she could get the time off work from his own restaurant. Yes, but there were procedures, there were other managers, there was the simple courtesy of it, and he had asked none of it. He hadn't asked a single question about her life, her circumstances. Whether there was anyone who would miss her for 2 weeks. Whether there was anyone who would come looking if she didn't come back, because he already knew. He had known all of it before she'd ever set foot in that little office. The passport, the lack of ties, the dying grandmother, the exact price of a heart with nothing left to lose. He had known, and he had assembled it, and he had built the offer around it, the way you build a trap around. The thing you know the animal cannot resist. And the terrible part, the part that kept her awake, was that even seeing it, even naming it to herself in the back of that cab, she already knew she'd be standing on the curb at noon. Not only for her grandmother, though God knew that was reason enough, reason to sell almost anything, but because something in Dario Ravena's eyes, in that little office, had told her the truth underneath the polite offer. That no was not really one of the options. That the ticket and the cash and the 2 weeks were the pleasant version of a thing that had other, less pleasant versions. That she had, in some way she couldn't yet trace, already been chosen, and that being chosen by a man like that was not a thing you talked your way out of. Simply, when she got home, would not come. She lay in her narrow bed in the dark and listened to the radiator knock its irregular rhythm against the pipe, and her mind went around and around. Her grandmother's hands, dusted with flour, working dough, the smell of rosemary that lived in the old woman's sweaters, that low, warm laugh, the one that started deep and rose up like something bubbling over, and then cutting across all of it, unwanted, those other eyes, dark, sharp, cold, patient, reading her across a desk like a page in a book he'd already decided to buy. By the time the window went gray with dawn, her decision was made. It had been made, really, from the moment she'd seen the ticket. Everything after that was just her conscience catching up. She would go to Italy. She would sit with her Nana one last time, hold her hand, say the things that needed saying. Whatever came after that, whatever Dario Ravena wanted from her, in the end, she would face it when it came, and not 1 minute before. She packed like a machine, her hands moving on their own while her mind stood somewhere off to the side and watched. Practical clothes, folded tight. A black dress because she knew, with the certainty that hollowed her out, that she would need it, that there was a funeral somewhere in the next 2 weeks, with her grandmother at the center of it. Her passport, checked and rechecked, and, last, the fat envelope of emergency cash she had kept for 6 months hidden inside a hollowed-out paperback on the shelf. Run money. The money you keep when you have learned, the hard way, that the ground can open under you at any moment, that a woman with cash in her hand has options a woman without it does not. She'd carried that book from the old apartment to this one, without ever telling a soul it was more than a book. She tucked it into the bottom of the suitcase now, under the folded clothes, the way you'd pack a weapon. At 11:30 she stood at her window and watched the street below. The neighborhood wasn't much. It never had been. But it was hers, bought with her own careful money, and she'd been safe here, or she'd believed she was, across the street, leaning against a lamppost, with the collar of a dark coat turned up against the cold. A man was smoking a cigarette, unhurried, comfortable, like he had all the time in the world and nowhere he'd rather be, and she realized, with a slow crawl of ice up her spine, that he had been there since she woke, that he was not waiting for a bus, or a friend, or a ride. He was watching her building. He was watching her window. He was watching her at noon exactly, not a minute before, not a minute after a black SUV slid up to the curb below, tinted glass. An engine so quiet she couldn't hear it through the window. And across the street, the man at the lamppost dropped his cigarette, ground it under his heel, and said something into a device clipped at his ear. And she understood. Ravena had had her watched all morning. Not out of interest, out of insurance. Making certain, with a man on the street and a car at the curb, that the animal did not bolt before the door of the trap swung shut. She could still not go down. The thought came clear and cold. She could stay up here, lock the door, pretend she wasn't home, let the car sit at the curb until whoever was inside it gave up, and then she saw her grandmother's face, in her mind, waiting, turning toward the door of a hospice room, hazel eyes searching, hoping, and she knew there had never been a choice at all. She picked up her suitcase, took one last look at the small apartment that had been her hiding place, the radiator, the window, the shelf where a hollowed-out book had held her freedom, and she went down. The driver was broad and silent, cut from the same cloth as the bodyguard. He took her suitcase from her without a word and opened the rear door of the SUV, and she slid in half, expecting to find Dario Ravena waiting for her in the dark of the back seat, but the seat was empty. Cool leather. The city sliding by behind smoked glass. "Where is Mr. Ravena?" she asked as they pulled away from the curb. "Meeting you at the airfield, Miss Fioravanti." The driver's eyes found hers in the rearview mirror, held them a beat, and returned to the road. Not the airport. The airfield. They did not go to the airport. They drove past it, past the terminals and the long-term parking, and the roar of commercial jets climbing out over the lake, to a smaller place at the edge of the city, a private field. Low buildings. A stretch of tarmac where a single sleek jet sat waiting with its engines already turning over, a low hum you felt in your teeth. No lines, no security, no taking off her shoes, no laptop out of the bag, no one checking anything at all. She was walked from the car to the stairs of the plane by a woman in a crisp charcoal suit who introduced herself, briskly, as Serafina, Mr. Ravena's assistant, and who took her measure in a single professional glance, and clearly filed her under a category Ginevra couldn't quite read. Inside, the plane was cream leather and dark polished wood. 8 seats that looked more like small throne airplane seats, a lounge area at the back, and beyond it a door that she suspected led to a private cabin. And at the far window, his back to her, one hand in his trouser pocket, stood Dario Ravena, watching the ground crew work. He turned as she came up the last step, and once again the sheer fact of him hit her like a change in the weather, the presence of the man, the way the air of a space seemed to organize itself around him. "Ginevra," he said, "I'm glad you came." She gripped the strap of her purse. "I need to see my grandmother." Something moved in his eyes. She thought it might have been respect. "Direct," he said. "I like that." "Very much." He gestured her to a seat. A server appeared as if from nowhere, set an espresso in front of him. And, in front of her, a cappuccino foamed, smooth and perfect, a dusting of cocoa. She had not told a single person in this country how she took her coffee. She sat down on the very edge of the enormous leather seat, the way you'd sit on a chair you didn't quite trust. "I had some things sent aboard for you," he said, watching her over the rim of the small cup. "Clothes. For the meetings we'll be attending." Appropriate to the settings, her spine went stiff. "I brought clothes." "I'm sure you did." 2 words, and the tone of them made perfectly clear what he thought of whatever she had folded into her suitcase. "These are simply additional options. Consider it part of the arrangement." She wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell him she was not his to dress, that she didn't need his charity, that she'd worn her own clothes to worse rooms than his. But something stopped the words in her throat because she understood, sitting there, that this was not charity. Charity is given and forgotten. This was something else. This was the first thread. A gift you cannot refuse is not a gift. It is a leash held out with a smile, and the moment you take it, you have agreed to be led. And she was going to take it. For Florence, for her grandmother. She was going to take all of it and wear all of it, and she knew, even now, that each thing she accepted would make her a little more his. For 20 minutes he laid out what he expected of her. Translation at his meetings, accurate, quiet, complete. Attendance at certain dinners. The handling of some correspondence in Italian. None of it, on its face, was wrong. None of it was a thing she could point to and say, that is the part where you own me. And yet the whole of it, taken together, hummed with the understanding that she was in his world now, and that his world did not have doors marked exit. "Any questions?" he asked when he had finished 1,000. But only one that mattered. "Why me?" she said. Really, he studied her a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket, drew out another slim folder. How many folders did this man carry, and set it on the table between them? Open it. She was learning to dread those 2 words in his mouth. She flipped it open. A photograph first. Herself, 3 years younger, at her college graduation. Cap and gown, arm around her grandmother, who had flown all the way from Italy for the day, and was beaming up at the camera like the sun had personally chosen to shine. Beneath it, a copy of her degree international business, a minor in finance. Then pages, a background check, thorough and cold, every address she'd ever held, every job she'd ever worked, her credit score, her bank, the shape of her small, careful life, reduced to data. And then the last page. Her blood turned to ice, a police report. From her old life, from the one night she had finally, after years, picked up the phone and called for help. and clipped to it photographs, the ones the officer had taken that night at the hospital, of her wrists, of her throat, of what a man who had once brought her flowers had left on her body when the flowers stopped working. Her hands were shaking as she closed the folder. "How did you get this? I make it my business to know who works for me." His voice had gone quieter, almost gentle, but his eyes stayed sharp as ever, and the gentleness only made it worse. "Even those who bring drinks in my restaurants. This is..." Anger flared up through the fear, sudden and hot. "This is not knowing your employees. This is an invasion. This is..." "Privacy," he said, "is a luxury very few people can truly afford." And he took the folder gently back from her hands and slid it away inside his jacket, back to wherever her secrets lived now. "To answer your question, I chose you because you are qualified. Because you are discreet, you understood every word those men said tonight and gave away nothing. Don't think I failed to notice. And because there is no one in your life who would make you a risk to me. I have family," she said. "A dying grandmother. No parents. Both gone," he said it without cruelty, which was somehow more cruel than if he'd meant it to wound. "No brothers, no sisters, no one serious since you left Chicago's other half behind. A handful of acquaintances, no true friends. You keep to yourself. You work harder than you have to. You send money home every month to a hospice you cannot really afford, and you try very hard every day to be invisible." His eyes came up and held hers. "But you were never invisible to me." "Genevra," a chill went through her, root to crown, because that was not the sentence of a man who had glanced at an employee file last week. How long had he been watching? Since she'd started at the restaurant? Since before that? How far back did the folder in his jacket really go? "We should board," he said, standing, the moment closing over, like water. "It's a long way to Florence." She followed him to her seat, because there was nothing else in the world to do. The jet climbed. Chicago fell away and shrank and vanished into the cloud. The whole city that had been her hiding place gone in a matter of minutes, and she sat in cream-colored leather 30,000 feet over the frozen earth, beside a man who had studied her life like a map before she'd ever known he existed, and she felt the truth of it settle down into her bones and make itself at home there. She was in his world now, and there was no easy way back out. Exhaustion took her eventually, the grief, the sleepless night, the sheer weight of the day. She woke to a hand on her shoulder and his face inches from hers. "We're stopping to refuel," he said, straightening. "Stretch your legs if you like. We have an hour." She looked out the window, full dark now, a small airfield. Snow gathered at the edges of the runway lights. Where are we? Iceland. They weren't even flying a normal route. The thought arrived cold and clear. The commercial flights to Florence did not touch down in Iceland in the dead of night. This was a route chosen for other reasons, by a man who did not care to be tracked, inside a small terminal built for private flights. Hushed, carpeted, empty, he disappeared down a corridor with Serafina, speaking low. And, for one moment, one single unguarded moment, Ginevra was alone. The thought came up in her like lightning. This could be my chance. She could find someone, ask for help. Say the words out loud, "I think I'm being taken somewhere against my will," and see what happened, except she was in Iceland, in the middle of the night. Without her passport, which was zipped into her carry-on, which was still aboard the plane. She had cash, but no way home. No way through a border, no way anywhere at all. And her grandmother was still in Florence, still dying, still counting down the small number of days she had left, waiting for a granddaughter who, if Ginevra bolted now, would never arrive. She found a restroom and stood at the sink with both hands braced on the cold porcelain and made herself breathe. Piano, cuore mio. Slowly, the fear cannot live in a slow breath. And by the time she lifted her head and looked at her own pale face in the mirror, she had made a decision, a real one, chosen. With her eyes open, she would go. She would see her grandmother. She would do the honest parts of the work, the translation, the dinners, whatever was clean, and she would watch him, every hour, every gesture. And the very moment this thing turned into something she could not live with, she would run. She had run before. She still knew how. She found a small cafe counter, ordered a tea, and wrapped both cold hands around the warm cup. She was so deep inside her own head that she didn't hear him approach. "Feeling better after your rest?" She looked up. Dario, sliding into the seat across from her, an espresso in his hand, entirely at ease. "Your grandmother's condition is stabilized." he said, watching her face with that same close attention. Somewhat. I had my people check with the facility while you slept. The doctor believes she'll hold on until we arrive. She nearly dropped the cup. You checked on her. Why? It would be unfortunate to travel all this way and arrive too late, he said simply, as though it were obvious. I dislike wasted journeys. The coldness of it, she should have been furious. It was the kind of thing that should have made her stand up and walk away. Instead, and she hated this about herself, a strange relief moved through her. Because whatever his reasons, however transactional, the fact of his reach meant she would very likely make it in time. It meant one more day with her Nana. And a woman running out of days will take that gift from any hand, no matter how cold the hand that offers it. Thank you, she said, quietly. He inclined his head, a small, precise motion that managed to accept her gratitude and make clear at the same time that he did not require it, and never had. Dawn was breaking as the jet began its long descent into Florence. Golden light spilled across a landscape she would have known blindfolded, would have known by the smell of it, by the shape of the hills against the sky. Terracotta rooftops crowded along the river. The Arno, a ribbon of hammered silver winding through it all, and beyond the city the hills rising green and gold and gray, dressed in olive groves and lines of cypress, standing like sentinels along the old roads home. Despite all of it, despite the folder and the watcher and the cold-eyed man across the aisle, her heart lifted at the sight of it. We'll stay at my villa in the hills, Dario said, coming to sit across from her, straightening the cuffs of his shirt. A car will take you to your grandmother this afternoon and bring you back for a dinner at 8. Not I'll take you. A car will take you. She heard the distinction and understood it exactly. She would be moved through this trip like a parcel where he wished, when he wished, delivered and collected on his schedule. He handed her a small black phone. Keep this on you. It's secure. My number is the only one in it. If there's an emergency, if you need anything, you use it. She took it. One more tether. One more fine thread wound around her wrist, tying her to him. The plane taxied to a private hangar where 2 black cars waited on the tarmac. As they came down the stairs into the cold Tuscan morning, Dario placed his hand at the small of her back, the first time he had touched her, light and warm, and even through the fabric of her coat it seemed to burn, a brand pressed to her spine. Welcome to Florence, Ginevra, he murmured, his mouth close to her ear, or perhaps I should say, welcome home. The villa, when they reached it, took what little breath she had left. It was not a house, it was an estate, honey-colored stone gone gold in the morning light. Terracotta tiles, gardens laid out and tended with obvious daily care, olive trees older than her grandmother, older maybe than the country she'd flown from, a circular drive of pale gravel, and stone steps, and great wooden doors that swung open as the cars approached, as though the house itself had been standing there, all this time, simply waiting for him to come home. An older woman with a kind, deeply lined face met her inside and introduced herself in Italian as Rosa. She led Ginevra up a grand staircase, down a corridor hung with paintings that belonged in a museum, to a set of double doors, which she opened with a small flourish. The room beyond was larger than Ginevra's entire apartment in Chicago. A 4-poster bed dressed in cream linen, a fireplace laid ready, floor-to-ceiling windows that opened onto a private balcony above the whole sweep of the Tuscan countryside, and in the open closet hung with care a row of garment bags, a dozen of them at least. She crossed the room and unzipped one, a black cocktail dress, exactly her size, another a tailored blazer, deep and dark. Thousands upon thousands of dollars of clothing chosen for a body he had measured with nothing but his eyes in the pages of a folder, and on the bed, a small velvet box with a card beside it. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, a delicate gold necklace, a single pearl resting in its cradle. The card read in a hand as unreadable as his signature, for tonight's dinner, D. She sank down onto the edge of the enormous bed with the pearl held loose in her palm, and let the full weight of where she stood come down on her all at once. She was in Dario Ravena's world now, surrounded by his wealth, housed by his generosity, subject in every hour to his control. And with each gift, each gesture, each small perfect thing chosen and given, she could feel the invisible chains drawing a fraction tighter around her wrists. And yet, in a few hours, she would see her grandmother. One last time. And for that, only for that, she had sold herself into the keeping of a man whose true nature was still a locked door to her, a man whose eyes seemed to see straight through the careful walls she'd spent years building, a man whose presence set her heart going, in a way she was terrified to name and refused, for now, to name at all. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known, sitting there with a stranger's pearl, warming in her hand, was that the reason he had crossed an ocean for her had nothing to do with translation, or meetings, or the shape of a business deal, and everything to do with a photograph, taken outside a shop in Palermo. In the year 1989, a photograph of two young men, smiling, standing shoulder to shoulder in the Sicilian sun. One of them was Dario Ravena's father, and the other was a man named Tommaso Fioravanti, her grandfather. The hospice sat in a walled garden on the edge of Florence. It was a modern building, glass and pale stone, clean lines, quiet, and it looked almost apologetic set against the ancient city around it, as if it knew it was 500 years too young for the streets it stood in, as if it had been built, deliberately, to hold people gently while the world let go of them. The driver came around and opened her door and handed her a bouquet of lilies she had not seen him carrying. White, heavy-headed, their scent already rising in the cold air. "Mr. Ravena thought you might want these," he said. "I'll wait, however long you need." "Take your time, Miss Fioravanti." She swallowed the ache that rose in her throat and took the flowers. Their sweetness filled her nose as she walked through the automatic doors, her heart slamming against her ribs. At the reception desk she gave her grandmother's name, and the nurse's eyes went wide and warm. "Ah, Miss Fioravanti. Yes, we've been expecting you." And then she leaned in, lowering her voice, as if sharing good news that was almost too good to say aloud. "Your grandmother is having a very good day today. The new medication that Mr. Ravena arranged, it's made such a difference. She's so much more comfortable." "Ginevra went still. Mr. Ravena arranged," she repeated. The nurse nodded, a small crease of confusion appearing between her brows. "Yes, the specialist. He flew in from Switzerland this morning, very early. You didn't know?" She shook her head. She could not for a moment find any words at all, because while she had been sleeping in a cream leather seat somewhere over the Atlantic, Dario Ravena had flown a specialist across a border. She had not asked him to. She would never have dreamed of asking him to. He had simply done it, quietly, in the dark, without a word, and let her find out from a stranger at a desk. And she stood there in the bright lobby of that hospice holding a dead man's flowers, and did not know what to do with the size of it, with the shape of it, with the way it refused to fit any of the boxes she'd built for him. The nurse led her down a corridor to a private room, another of his arrangements. She understood now, everything here bearing his invisible fingerprints, and eased the door open. "Signora Fioravanti," she said softly. "Look who's come to see you." The woman in the bed bore almost no resemblance to the grandmother of Ginevra's childhood. That grandmother had been round and strong, forearms flowered to the elbow, a woman who could carry a full basket up a hill without breaking her stride. This woman was small. The cheeks that had been full were hollow now, the skin gone papery and translucent. So thin the blue of the veins showed through, so thin the light seemed to pass through her. But the eyes were the same. That same clear hazel, her mother's eyes, and her own, the eyes the whole line had passed down like an heirloom, and when they turned and found Ginevra standing in the doorway, they lit. Recognition, and under it, a joy so pure and so complete that it broke something open in Ginevra's chest. "Ginevra." Cuore mio, weak the voice, little more than a breath, but clear. Ginevra crossed the room and sank down onto the chair at the bedside and gathered the frail hands into both of her own, and they were so light, so cool, so much smaller than she remembered. "Nana," she whispered. The tears were already coming, and she let them, this time. "I'm here. I'm here. I made it, I'm here." The nurse slipped out and drew the door shut behind her, and for an hour the whole world narrowed to that small warm room. Her grandmother talked in Italian, always in Italian, the language they had only ever spoken to each other. She talked about the neighbors back in the old town, some of them dead 30 years, alive again for a moment in her telling. About the nurses, who were kind, who were angels, who brought her broth. About how beautiful Ginevra had grown, how like her mother she looked now, how the years had done that. She drifted, sometimes, mid-sentence, her eyes going soft and far, and in those moments she called Ginevra by her dead mother's name and asked her things only her mother would have known. and then she would surface again, sharp and present, and be entirely herself. "Tell me about America," she said, in one of the clear moments. "Are you happy there, Corey mio? Truly happy?" And Ginevra made herself smile, and made her voice light, and lied. "Yes, Nana, I have a good job, good people around me, a nice apartment. I'm happy. Really." The lies sat like ash on her tongue, but she could not lay the truth down on that thin chest, not the years of fear, not the flight in the night, not the cold-eyed man who had brought her home. Some kindnesses are lies. Her grandmother would die believing her granddaughter was safe and happy, and that belief was the last gift Ginevra had left to give her, and she would not take it back for the sake of her own honesty. But the old woman studied her face with a sudden startling sharpness, the drift gone entirely, and Ginevra remembered too late that this had always been the one person on earth she could not fool. "And this man," her grandmother said, "the one who brought you home to me, who is he to you?" Ginevra kept her face still. "What man, Nana?" "The one who sent the doctor, from Switzerland," a frail wave of the hand toward the window, "the world, all of it, the important one. The nurses whisper about him when they think I'm sleeping. They say he is powerful. They say," and her voice dropped, "dangerous, perhaps." Ginevra's blood ran cold. "He's my employer, Nana. That's all he is. My employer." The old woman's hand tightened around hers, with a strength that seemed impossible in something so frail. "Be careful, Corey mio, be very careful. Men like that." Her eyes held Ginevra's, and there was something in them older than the illness, older than the room. "Men like that take what they want, and they are gentle about it, some of them. So gentle you don't feel the taking until it's already done." And then, as suddenly as it had come, the sharpness left her, and her gaze went soft and distant again, and a dreamy small smile touched her mouth. "Your grandfather was like that, you know," she said. "To the ceiling, to the past, so handsome, so certain of himself, so sure of what he wanted. And when he decided that what he wanted was me," the smile deepened, "well, there was no escaping it. There was no closing that door once he'd opened it." A pause, and her thumb moved absently over the back of Ginevra's hand. "Not that I wanted to escape. That was the trouble with your grandfather. You never, ever wanted to escape." Ginevra sat with her until she slept, the breathing gone shallow but steady, the frail hands going slack in hers. She kissed the papery forehead, breathing in the faint ghost of rosemary that somehow still clung to her, even here, even now, and she slipped out in the corridor to find the doctor. She found him at the nurse's station. Young, Swiss, with kind and tired eyes. "How long?" she asked, bluntly. There was no point now in the softness. He hesitated, the way they always hesitate. "With the new medication, a week, perhaps 2. It's very hard to say with certainty. The cancer has spread significantly. But what I can tell you is that she'll be comfortable now. There will be no pain. We can promise her that much." She nodded, the tears rising and pushed back down. "Thank you," she said, "for coming all this way." He looked for a moment faintly uncomfortable. "Mr. Ravena was very persuasive," he said, "and very generous. Your grandmother is receiving the best care that exists, Miss Fioravanti. I've cleared my schedule. I'll be staying in Florence to monitor her myself, for as long as he stopped. He's started again, for as long as she needs me." She thanked him once more and walked out into the failing afternoon light, where the driver waited by the car, patient as a stone, and her chest was a tangle she could not begin to undo. Grief for her grandmother, enormous and near. Gratitude toward a man she did not trust, sharp and unwelcome, and beneath both of them, running under everything like a current under ice, that low steady unease that had not left her since the office in Chicago. Because why? Why would a man like Dario Ravena fly a specialist across a national border? At dawn, for the dying grandmother of a waitress he had known for 3 months, employers did not do that. Strangers did not do that. Even generous men did not do that. Which meant he was not a stranger. Not to her, or not to her family, or not in some way she could not yet see. Which meant all of this: the ticket, the villa, the pearl, the specialist, the whole gilded cage of it was about something. Something old. Something she had not been told. Something that had been waiting for her long before she'd ever heard the name. Ravenna whispered in a freezer in Chicago. Back at the villa, a bath had already been drawn in the marble bathroom off her room hot, steaming faintly, scented with jasmine, rose petals floating on the surface. Rosa was waiting to tell her that Mr. Ravenna had asked her to help the signorina prepare. that the guests would arrive at 8, and that there was, she said, laid out on the bed, an ensemble he had chosen. You.Genevra thanked her and sent her gently away, and sank into the hot water alone, and let it pull the tension out of her muscles knot by knot, and thought, by the time she rose, skin flushed pink, hair wrapped in a towel, she had made a decision to match the one she'd made in the Reykjavik restroom. She would play the part. She would translate and attend his dinners, and wear his clothes, and be the beautiful, useful thing at his side, and she would do it well until she understood what he actually wanted from her. She owed him that much, for the specialist, for her grandmother's comfort, for the days he had bought her, however coldly, at that bedside. But she would watch every second of it, and the instant the thing turned into something she could not survive, she would be gone. The dress laid out on the bed was midnight blue. Modest in the front, a clean high neckline, and, when she turned to the mirror, daringly, breathtakingly low in the back. Matching heels, the pearl necklace beside it on the coverlet. She dressed slowly, carefully, and styled her hair into loose dark waves over one shoulder, and applied her makeup with a steady hand, and clasped the pearl at the base of her throat. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror was a stranger, polished, elegant, expensive. The perfect ornament for a powerful man's arm. And Ginevra looked at that stranger for a long moment, and felt something twist in her, half fear, half a terrible and unwelcome thrill, because she did not entirely dislike what she saw. And that, she thought, was exactly how the chains went on. Not with force, with flattery, with the mirror, a knock at the door. She expected Rosa. She opened it to Dario himself. Black suit, crisp white shirt, and a tie of midnight blue that matched her dress exactly, down to the shade, because of course he had made certain it would. He stood in the doorway with one hand in his pocket, and his dark eyes moved over her, slow, from the loose waves to the pearl to the line of the dress, and whatever the not smile was, it touched his mouth. Perfect, he said, the single word, and it went through her like a current. She smoothed the front of the dress with a hand she willed not to shake. Thank you for the clothes. And the specialist, she swallowed. That the doctor. That was unexpected. That was kind. He stepped into the room and drew the door shut behind him. How is she? Comfortable. Better than I feared. They say a week. Maybe 2. He nodded, unreadable, and moved on. Because there was work to do. Tonight is important. 4 men. Old Florentine families, old money, old connections, older grudges. They will speak Italian all evening, even though every one of them is fluent in English, because it makes them feel they have the advantage, the not smile again. Quicker this time, and you will let them go on, feeling it. He crossed to her, close, and lifted a hand, and his fingers brushed the pearl at her throat, brief and cool, and somehow electric where they touched her skin. You translate everything for me, accurately, completely, with one exception. If any of them says something unguarded, something they believe I cannot understand, something they would never say if they knew you touch your pearl. Like so. And I will know to listen closely to whatever comes next. She nodded, not trusting her voice with him standing this near. Then he drew a second velvet box from his jacket and held it out. Pearl earrings inside, made to match the necklace. I can't, she said, and found her voice to say it. The dress, the necklace. It's already far too much. I can't keep taking. You can, he said, and you will. Tonight you represent me. Everything about you must be perfect. He said it flatly. As a matter of fact, not a matter of debate. She held his gaze. It was a small thing, a foolish thing, but she made herself do it, one small act of defiance, planted like a flag. And after tonight, she said, after these 2 weeks. What then? Something dangerous flickered far back in his eyes. Let's focus, he said, on tonight. He held the earrings out. He did not put them on. Her himself did not close the distance that far, but he held them there between them, and made it perfectly, silently clear that no was not a word she would be using. She took them. Their fingers brushed. She turned to the mirror and fixed them at her ears. They descended to the grand staircase together, and she felt the eyes of the household staff follow them down, curious, speculative, reading whatever it was they thought they were seeing. In the grand dining room, a table had been set for 6, all crystal and heavy silver, and Serafina stood near the sideboard speaking low with the staff. She looked up as they entered, her cool professional gaze moving over Ginevra head to foot, assessing, filing. The Corsi brothers have arrived, she told Dario, in the drawing room. And Marchetti with them, and Belandi, on his way. 5 minutes out, Ginevra's ear snagged on the last name and would not let it go, Belandi. She did not know why. She had never heard it in her life. But something in her, the same something that read a room before she entered it, the same animal instinct that had kept her alive across years, she did not like to remember, went suddenly, quietly still. The way the whole world goes still in the moment before a storm, when you can feel the first drop coming though it hasn't yet fallen. That name mattered. She knew it the way you know a thing in your body before your mind has any reason for it. Dario guided her toward the drawing room, his hand warm and possessive at the small of her back. "Remember," he murmured, close as they reached the door, "tonight you are not a translator. You are an extension of me, my eyes, my ears. Nothing said in that room is beneath your notice." The drawing room was a masculine space leather and dark wood, a fire crackling in a stone hearth, the blue-gray haze of expensive cigars already hanging in the warm air. 3 men turned as they came in. 2 of them shared the same features so plainly they could only be brothers, heavy, silver-haired, somewhere in their 60s. And a third, younger, with sharp, restless eyes. And a suit, sharper still. "Gentlemen," Dario said, in English, his hand at her back. "Allow me to present Ginevra Fioravanti. My associate." The elder brother took her hand and kissed it with old-world courtesy. The younger merely nodded, already dismissing her. And then, believing the introductions concluded and the help accounted for, the men slid back into Italian, quick, colloquial, the language of people who did not expect to be understood by the woman pouring their drinks. "You didn't tell us you'd found yourself such a beautiful assistant, Ravena," the elder Corsi said, his eyes still on her. "Where have you been keeping her hidden?" "Miss Fioravanti has only recently joined my organization," Dario answered, in flawless Italian. "And she speaks Italian, does she?" The younger asked, skeptical, half a smirk on his mouth. Ginevra smiled. And she answered him in Tuscan Italian, so pure, so effortlessly native, that his smirk fell clean off his face. "I was born in Florence, signore. I lived here until I was 18. I imagine my accent is rather better than yours." A beat of silence. Then the elder brother laughed, delighted, and the men exchanged glances, and she felt the whole temperature of their attention change. Equilibration, fast and total, of men who had just realized the furniture could hear. The door opened. The final guest came in. He was younger than the others, 40, perhaps, and he moved with the loose, easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life lain awake worrying about money. His eyes found her the instant he entered the room, and they stayed on her, and his smile, when it came, was a predator's smile. The smile of something that has just seen something it intends to have. He said warmly, crossing the room to embrace Dario like an old friend. "You've truly outdone yourself this time," and Dario's hand, at the small of her back, tightened. "Almost nothing. A fraction." "But she felt it, Corrado," he said. "Ginevra Fioravanti, my associate." Corrado Belandi took her hand and held it a beat too long, his thumb pressing once against her knuckles. "Enchanted," he said in Italian. Truly, enchanted, and everything in her recoiled, though she kept her face smooth and let her hand rest in his, because there was something cold in the way he looked at her. Not desire, or not only desire, assessment. The look of a man taking the measure of a piece on a board. He was already playing 3 moves ahead on. Dinner was announced. Dario seated her at his right hand. Belandi, directly across. The wine was poured, the antipasti served, and the talk ranged wide. Business folded into gossip, folded into old shared history. And beneath the pleasantness of it all, the real reason for the evening slowly surfaced. A shipping company. One Dario intended to acquire. One in which all 4 of these men held tangled, overlapping interests. "The price you're offering is an insult," the younger Corsi said, blunt. In Italian, "The company is bleeding money," Dario replied, smooth, in the same tongue. "I'm doing you a favor taking it off your hands." "The company loses money now," the elder countered, leaning in. "But the assets, Ravena, the assets alone are worth 3 times your offer, and you know it, overvalued on your own books," Dario said. "We both know that too." She translated it all faithfully into his ear when he needed her. Though the truth was he needed her very little, his own Italian was perfect. Her presence was theater, mostly, a demonstration of resources, of reach, of a man who could produce a beautiful native speaker at his elbow the way another man produces a good watch. And despite herself, despite everything, she found she was impressed. His command of the numbers was total. His negotiation was ruthless, and yet somehow fair. He pressed every advantage he had, and took nothing more than the advantage gave him, and never once reached for greed. And then as the dessert was being set down before them, sugar and cream, and the clink of small silver spoons, Corrado Belandi leaned toward the Corsi brothers and dropped his voice and said, in rapid low Italian, absolutely certain the man at the head of the table could not follow it, "Let him have the company. Let him. The real value was never in the company. The real value is in the warehouse contents, in Livorno, and he doesn't know about those yet." And Ginevra's hand began to rise toward the pearl at her throat, the signal, the one thing she'd been told to do. But halfway there, her hand stopped, because in that half-second, a thought came to her, whole and clear and dangerous. If she gave the signal, Dario would know. He would lean in, and press and win the point. Clean. Useful. Exactly what she'd been asked to do, except the signal would only ever tell Dario what Belandi had already said. It would give him this one card and no more. And Ginevra did not want this one card. She wanted the whole hand. She wanted to know how deep the thing went, what was really in those warehouses, how badly these men needed it hidden, and she would never learn any of that by tapping a pearl and letting Dario ask a careful question. So she did something reckless. She leaned to Dario's ear, as if translating the next exchange, and she translated it accurately, almost. Almost. She changed a single word. When the elder Corsi, a moment later, referred to the warehouses as holding documents, she breathed into Dario's ear that he had said documents and product, a small lie, a gamble with no way to take it back once it left her mouth. And Dario, trusting the translation she had handed him, taking the bait she had baited without his knowledge, turned to the table and said, in smooth, unhurried English, "Gentlemen, let me revise my offer. I'll take the company and full inventory rights to all associated properties, including the Livorno warehouses, including their contents." The room went still as glass. Belandi's head came up sharply, because he had never said the word product. He had been so careful. He had said value. He had said contents. He had guarded that word like a man guards a knife. And now Ravena was naming the Livorno inventory outright, casually, as if he had known about it all along, as if it had never been a secret at all. Belandi's eyes cut across the table to Ginevra, fast, cold, and she watched the understanding arrive behind them. "You told us she was only an assistant," he said, in Italian. His voice had gone to ice. "I told you she was my associate," Dario corrected, in Italian, mild as anything, and a very valuable one. The tension crackled beneath the civility of the table like a current running under still water. Ginevra kept her face perfectly blank. But her heart was slamming so hard, she thought they must be able to hear it. Because she had just done something. Not signaled, not merely translated. She had steered. She had taken a table of dangerous men who had spent decades learning to give nothing away, and she had moved them where she wanted them, one changed word at a time, and Dario knew it. She could feel him beside her, going very quiet, reassessing her from the ground up, the way a man reassesses a card he'd taken for a 2, and just watched turn over as an ace. The negotiation ground on for another hour, growing more knotted, more technical, but the shape of it had already been decided in that one moment. By the time the 4 men rose to leave, close to midnight, a deal was done, a deal that plainly, decisively favored Dario. She stood beside him in the foyer as he saw them out, his hand at her waist. Belandi was the last to go. At the door he paused, and his eyes moved slowly between the two of them, deliberate, taking his time. "You should be more careful about who you trust, Ravena," he said, in Italian, his gaze coming to rest and staying on her. "Beautiful women have a way of complicating a man's affairs." "I trust Miss Fioravanti completely," Dario said. There was no room in his voice for anything else. "Good night, Corrado." The door shut, and Ginevra let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like the whole evening. Dario turned to her, and for the first time all night, for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. A real one. It transformed his whole face, and it in her stomach that she did not want. "Undone. You didn't signal," he said. "No. You lied to me. In the translation." Her stomach dropped. You gave me more than I asked for." His eyes were bright, alive, with something close to wonder. "You handed me the entire warehouse and let him hang himself on it before he ever saw the rope." A pause. Where? He said. Did you learn to do a thing like that? She lifted her chin. You read my file. You tell me. He laughed low and genuine and surprised, and she felt the sound of it move through her like heat from a fire she knew. She knew she had no business standing this close to. He took her to his study. It was warm in there, warmer than the rest of the villa. A fire, burning, low, lamplight on the leather spines of 1,000 books lining the walls. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquor from a heavy crystal decanter and put one in her hand, and she sipped it and let the whiskey burn its slow path down her throat and settle warm in her chest. Those warehouses, she said. They're important. Very. He loosened his tie, an oddly intimate gesture, the first careless thing she'd seen him do. What's stored in them could destroy all 4 of those men if it were found by the wrong people, and they know it, which is exactly why the company was priced the way it was, and why Belandi was so eager to let me have it, and so careful not to let me know what came with it. Illegal goods, she said. His eyes met hers over the rim of his glass. Let's just say, he said, that customs officials can be remarkably easy to distract. With the right incentive, she set her own glass down on the desk. Why are you telling me this? She said. Why bring me into something like this at all? You could have used me for the language and kept me in the dark about the rest. That would have been safer. For you. He set his glass down too and moved toward her, and the study was not a large room, and his presence filled what there was of it. Because you proved your value tonight, he said, in a way I did not expect and did not ask for. And because I find that I want you to understand what it is you're a part of now. A part of. She took an instinctive step back. I'm here to translate. For 2 weeks. To see my grandmother. That was the arrangement. That is the arrangement. Something darkened in his eyes. Arrangements, he said, change. Not this one. She heard the tremor in her own voice and pushed past it. Found the courage and the fear the way you sometimes can. I did what you asked tonight. I did it well. I expect you to do your part in return. He studied her a long moment, and she braced for the argument, for the pressure, for the smooth, immovable no she'd learned to expect from him. Instead, to her genuine surprise, he nodded. Of course, he said. You'll see your grandmother whenever you wish. The car and driver are yours. Relief moved through her, sudden and loosening. Thank you. But, he stepped closer, closing the small distance she had opened between them. We both know, you and I, that this has already become something more than what we agreed to in that office. Her back found the bookshelf, behind her. He raised a hand and set it flat against the shelf beside her head, not touching her, nowhere near touching her, and yet caging her all the same, the whole of his attention narrowing down onto her face. I don't belong in your world, she whispered, and heard her own voice betray her, the tremor giving away everything the words tried to hide, don't you? His free hand rose, and his fingers found the pearl at her throat and brushed the skin below it. You wear it, he said, as though you were born to it, as though it had only been waiting for you, and she could not deny it, not the electricity of it, not the treacherous way her body leaned toward his nearness, even as every alarm she had ever learned rang at once inside her skull. This is how it starts, said the voice that had kept her alive. This is exactly how it starts. So gentle you don't feel the taking until it's already done. I should go, she said. It's late. I should go. His hand moved from the pearl to her cheek. Gentle and firm. Ginevra, he said, and her name in his mouth was almost soft enough to be tender, and then his lips were on hers, softer than she would ever have believed of a man like him. It was a question, that kiss, not a demand and asking, not a taking, and he pulled back from it before she had even decided whether she meant to answer it or run from it. Good night, Ginevra, he said, and stepped away, and the cage of him opened and set her free. Sleep well, she fled. Up the stairs, into her room, the door shut and her back against it, her heart going like something trying to escape her chest. She stripped off the beautiful dress and unclasped the pearls and scrubbed the makeup from her face, and then she stood under the shower until the water ran cold and her skin was pink and raw, trying to wash the whole day off of her. But no water on earth could rinse away the truth she could no longer keep from herself. The kiss, the lie she'd told and won with, the dark thrill of steering that table. And underneath all of it, the worst thing, the unforgivable thing, that a part of her had liked it. She woke just after dawn, tangled in the silk sheets, her heart already going too fast, and she lay there staring up at the ornate ceiling and made a second decision to sit beside the first. She was going to find out who this man really was. Because a stranger does not fly a specialist across a border for a dying woman. A stranger does not build a folder that reaches back to a college graduation 3 years gone. A stranger does not look at you the way Dario Ravena looked at her, not with desire, or not only with desire, but with something stranger and older, something that felt almost like recognition, like a man who had been waiting a long time for a door to open, and had just watched it open. There was a reason for all of it, and she was going to find it. The chance came that same morning. Rosa had let something slip, days before half a sentence, forgotten as soon as it was said about the old records, the family papers, the things kept from before, in a small room off the library, boxes of a life going back and back. So while Dario took his morning calls behind the closed door of his study, while the great house ran its quiet routine around her, Ginevra found her way to that small room. Dust hung in the slats of light through the shutters. Boxes lined the shelves, floor to ceiling. Decades of a family's paper existence, waiting in the half-dark, and she looked. She did not know what for, not exactly. She looked because the not knowing had become unbearable. Until she found it, a box older than the others, the cardboard soft with age. Inside, photographs, letters tied with faded string, and a leather diary cracked along its spine. The ink inside gone brown with the years. The handwriting on the first page was familiar, because it was her grandmother's. Her hands went cold. Because why? Why would her grandmother's diary, her Nana's private diary, be here, in a locked room, in the villa of a man her grandmother had claimed? Only yesterday, not even to know. She opened it, careful of the brittle spine, and she read. The entries were old 1990, 91, a younger hand, the letters firmer, the ink darker at the start, and they told of a life Ginevra had never heard so much as a whisper of Palermo, of a business, of two families, the Ravenas and the Fioravantis, so tangled together, so bound by shared work and shared risk and shared blood, that the diary spoke of them as one, and of a man named Tommaso. Her grandfather. She had been told, her whole life, that he had died before she was born. Her Nana had never once spoken of him, not a story, not a photograph, not a name said aloud. Ginevra had always assumed it was grief, a wound too deep and too old to be touched, and so left alone, always, out of love. But the diary told a different story. The diary said he had not simply died. The diary said that in the winter of 1991, something had gone terribly wrong. In Palermo, a deal, a betrayal. That Dario's father, a young man then, no older than Dario was now, had walked, unknowing, into an ambush that should by every right have killed him. And that Tommaso Fioravanti had put himself between his friend and the trap, not with a gun, not with his body in the way of stories, with his name, because when the police came, and they came, in the aftermath, with warrants and questions, and a case built to bury someone, when the arrests were made and somebody had to answer for everything the two families had done together in the dark. It was Tommaso who stepped forward, Tommaso who confessed to all of it, alone, who took the charges, everyone, onto himself and gave the police the guilty man they needed so they would stop looking for the others, so that his friend Dario's father could walk free into the sun and go on to build an empire on the ground. Tommaso had bought him, and Tommaso had gone to prison for it, and he had died there, in a cell, 3 years later, for a debt that had never, in any just accounting, been his to pay. Ginevra sat down on the dusty floor of that small room with the diary open across her knees, and at last, at long last, she understood why a powerful man had crossed an ocean to find a waitress who had spent 6 years trying to disappear. It had never been about the meetings. Dario Ravena's father had spent his entire life carrying a debt he could never repay, the debt of a man who had watched his best friend die in a cage in his place. And when that father died, he had not been able to take the debt with him. He had handed it down to his son, a debt of honor, a debt of blood, and she, Ginevra Fioravanti, the invisible girl, the one who sent money home and asked the world for nothing, she was the living thread of the family her grandfather had died to save. That was why. That was the whole of it. That was the door he had been waiting to open. And then she turned the page because there was more. One last entry, set apart from the rest. Different ink, newer, a shakier hand, older. Written years after the others, it seemed. Her grandmother, no longer young, coming back to the diary one final time. to set down a thing she had carried alone for a very long time, and it named the man. The one who had set the ambush in Palermo. The one whose greed had turned two families against each other and lit the whole thing on fire. The one who had let Tommaso Fioravanti walk into a cell and rot there for a crime that had in truth belonged to him. The name, in her grandmother's brown and faded ink, was Belandi. Corrado Belandi, the man who had sat across from her at dinner the night before, who had held her hand a beat too long, who had smiled at her like a wolf across a table full of silver, who had paused at the door on his way out and looked at her with those cold and knowing eyes and said, "Be careful about who you trust." Ginevra's blood turned to ice in her veins, because the enemy at the table and the man who had killed her grandfather were one and the same, and she was sitting in the very middle of it, holding the proof in her two shaking hands. She found Dario in his study an hour later, the diary held against her chest, her face gone pale as the pearls she still wore at her throat. He looked up from his desk, and whatever he saw in her stopped whatever he'd been about to say. He set down the phone in his hand. "Slowly, I know," she said. "I know why you came for me. I know why any of this happened." She crossed the room and set the diary on his desk, open, to the entry with the brown ink and the shaking hand, and she watched him read it, watched his jaw go tight, watched the muscle jump once in his cheek. "Where did you find this?" he said, not looking up. "Does it matter?" He closed his eyes and let out a long breath, and when he opened them again, something had come away the armor, the smooth, cold surface she had never once seen crack. And underneath it, for the first time, she saw the man, or rather the boy inside the man, the boy who had grown up in the long shadow of a dead stranger's sacrifice, and a father who had never been able to forgive himself for it. "My father carried it his whole life," he said, quietly. "Every day of it. Your grandfather went into a cell so my father could go free, and my father never once forgave himself for taking the gift. Not in 40 years. A pause. On his deathbed, he took my hand and he made me promise. Find the Fioravantis, whatever is left of them, and make it right, whatever it costs, whatever it takes, so that," she said, and her voice cracked down the middle of it, "is what I am to you, a debt, a promise you made to a dying man." He rose from behind the desk and came around it toward her. "That is what you were," he said. "When I found your name in the employee records of one of my own restaurants, half a world away, yes. That is exactly what you were. A box to be checked, a debt to be closed, an obligation inherited, to be discharged as cleanly and as generously as possible, and then set down." His eyes held hers and did not let go. "And then you answered a telephone in Italian in the middle of my dinner, and you walked into my office that night, terrified out of your mind, and you refused, even so, look away from me. And you sat at my table and lied to my face and won me, a war I didn't know I was fighting." He shook his head slowly. "You stopped being a debt somewhere over the Atlantic, Ginevra. I couldn't tell you the moment it happened, and it terrifies me more than anything has terrified me. In a very long time, she had no answer for that. Nothing in her had an answer for that. So she said the only thing that still mattered above all the rest. Belandi, she said. It was Belandi. He set the ambush. He let my grandfather die in his place." Dario went very, very still. "I know," he said. She stared at him. "You knew?" "I suspected. For years. I never had proof, only the shape of it, only the way certain things never quite added up." He looked at the open diary on the desk. "Your grandmother just handed me the proof I've been looking for my entire adult life." And that was the moment the study door opened. Serafina, her face white, a phone in her hand. "The hospice just called," she said. Ginevra's heart stopped in her chest. "Nana, she's alive," Serafina said quickly. "She's alive. But she's gone. She's been taken. 20 minutes ago. 3 men, they walked in, they took her. The staff couldn't stop them. They were gone before anyone understood what was happening. The floor fell out of the world because a dying woman. A woman who could not walk, who could not stand, who could not lift her own hand to feed herself, who had a week left in her, maybe 2. Someone had taken her out of her bed, and Ginevra already knew. Before Serafina said another word, she knew in her bones whose men they had been. The phone in Serafina's hand buzzed. Unknown number. Dario took it and put it on speaker and set it down on the desk between the 3 of them, and a voice filled the room. Smooth, amused. A voice she had heard the night before say the word enchanted over a plate of dessert. "Ravenna," said Corrado Belandi, I believe I have something that belongs to you. Or forgive me something that belongs to her. If you touch her, Dario started. You'll do what? Exactly. A soft, unhurried laugh. No, I don't think so. Here's how this is going to go. The company, the warehouses, Livorno, all of it. Signed over to me in full by midnight tonight. Or the old woman will not live to see even the little time she had left. A pause. I am not a cruel man, Ravena, whatever you may think of me. I'll let her die comfortable, in her own bed with her nurses. If you're reasonable, Corrado, midnight, Belandi said. The old monastery above Fiesole. You know the one. Come alone. Bring the papers signed, a beat, and bring the girl. I have some questions for her. About how exactly she came to know what was sitting in my warehouse. The line went dead. Silence. Ginevra could not breathe. Because this was her doing. The lie at the dinner. The single word she had changed to feel clever, to feel powerful, to steer a table of dangerous men because she had been so proud, so pleased with her own cunning, and now Belandi knew she was dangerous, and now Belandi had her grandmother, and it was because of her. This is my stop, Dario's voice was iron. This is not your fault. This began 40 years ago. This began before you were born, in a shop in Palermo on a day neither of us was alive to see. Do not take it onto yourself. That is precisely the mistake that killed your grandfather. He has her, Dario. He's going to kill her. He is not. He was already moving, already reaching for his own phone, already dialing. Listen to me. Belandi wants the empire. He does not want a war he cannot win. And he knows he cannot win one against me outright. That is why he needs leverage. If I hand him what he's asking for, he loses the only card he holds. He knows that as well as I do. Which means the danger is in the exchange itself, not 1 minute before it. Then don't give him anything. Fight him. Take your men and, with your grandmother in that courtyard? He shook his head once, hard. No, we do this the smart way. Or we do not do it at all, and we lose her. Those are the only two roads, and I will not walk the second one. And that was the moment Ginevra made her decision, because she was done. Done being moved through the world like a parcel. Done being the beautiful, useful thing at the powerful man's side. Done being a debt, a box, an obligation, a piece on someone else's board to be defended or sacrificed as the game required. She had steered a room of dangerous men with a single changed word once. She could do it again. And this time she would not be steering it for a deal or to feel clever. This time she would be steering it for her grandmother's life. Then let me be smart, she said. Dario turned and looked at her, and she told him her plan. The monastery stood on the height above Fiesole, ancient, roofless, half-fallen. A ruin the moon turned the color of old bone. Broken walls, empty arches opened to the sky. Grass grown up between the flagstones of a cloister where monks had walked 600 years before and no one walked now. They came at midnight. Dario at the wheel, Ginevra beside him, a leather folder of signed papers in her lap, and beneath her dress, taped flat against her ribs where no one would think to look, a small recording device that Serafina had pressed into her hands an hour before they left. Recording, all of it. Because Belandi wanted a confession from her, wanted to know how she had learned his secret, she intended to walk out of that ruin with a confession from him instead. They passed through the broken gate on foot and into the open courtyard beneath the stars. And there in the center of it, in a wheelchair someone had carried up the hill and set on the uneven stone sat her grandmother. Small, frail, a blanket tucked over her knees against the cold night air, and her eyes, her grandmother's hazel eyes, found Ginevra across the ruined space, and they filled not with fear. Not with fear at all, with fury. Because even now, even dying, even carried up a mountain in the dark and set among the ghosts of monks as a bargaining chip in another man's war. Assunta Fioravanti was not afraid of the man standing beside her chair. Belandi stood behind the wheelchair with one hand resting lightly on its back, the way a man rests his hand on a possession. Two others flanked him, hard men, guns holstered but visible, not drawn but not hidden. Ravena, Belandi said, warm as a host welcoming guests. And the clever girl, right on time. I do appreciate punctuality. Let her go, Dario said. She's an old dying woman. She has nothing to do with any of this. On the contrary, Belandi's eyes slid to Ginevra. She has everything to do with it. She is the last of them, isn't she? The very last. Fioravanti left breathing. A slow smile spread across his face. Do you know, girl, your grandfather begged me at the end. In the cell. He was dying by then, and he sent word, and I went to him, and he begged me to tell the truth. to clear his name before he died, so that his family, someday, would know what he had done and why. A shrug, small and terrible. I didn't. Why would I? A confession is only useful to the man who withholds it, and there it was, he had said it. Out loud. Under the indifferent stars. Onto the small device taped against her ribs, but she needed more. She needed all of it, laid bare, past any doubt. So she kept her voice steady, and she pushed. You framed him, she said. The ambush in Palermo, that was you. You sold both families to the police and let my grandfather take the fall. Careful. He tilted his head, studying her. You speak as though you have proof of these things. I have his wife's diary, she said, in her own hand. Naming you, that landed. She watched it land, the flicker behind his eyes, quickly covered. A dying woman's diary, Belandi said, recovering his smoothness, the scribbles of a grieving widow. Worth nothing to anyone. Then why, Ginevra said, did you send 3 men to take a dying woman out of her bed tonight? If her diary is worth nothing, if her word is worth nothing, why are you so afraid of what an old woman remembers? Silence. And into that silence her grandmother spoke, weak, a thread of a voice, but it carried. It cut across the ruined courtyard, clear as a struck bell. You were a coward then, Corrado, a son said. Her voice shook, but not with fear, with a fury that had waited 40 years for a place to land. And you are a coward still. You let a good man, the best man I ever knew, die in a cage for your greed. And you have spent 30 years since dressing yourself up in fine suits and pretending to be something more than the rat you have always been. Belandi's face twisted. Old woman, hold your tongue. Don Tommaso knew what you were, she went on, unstoppable now. Before the end he knew. He said it to me, the last time they let me see him. He said Corrado will never be free. Not really. Not for a single day of his life. Because a man who sells his friend for money carries that friend's ghost on his back forever, her burning eyes fixed on him. So tell me, Corrado, how has the ghost been all these years? How has my Tommaso Wade riding on your back every day, all this time? And Belandi's hand tightened, white-knuckled on the back of the wheelchair. And his composure cracked straight down the middle, and out of the crack it came, pouring all of it. The thing he had carried and hidden and lied about for 40 years, torn loose, at last by a dying woman's contempt and flung out into the night. He was weak, Belandi snarled. You're Tommaso, your saint. Loyal like a dog, and just as stupid. I gave the Ravenas to the police, because they were about to cut me out of everything. I'd built everything, and I would not be cut out. And your husband, your precious husband. He stepped in front of it. Nobody asked him to. Nobody made him. He chose the cell. He chose to play the martyr for a man who forgot his name inside a year and got rich on his grave. His chest heaved. I did not kill him. Do you understand me? He killed himself, with that loyalty of his. And if I stood where I stood in 1991 again, I would do every last piece of it again. The courtyard rang with it, and then went silent, and Ginevra stood very, very still, because she had it, she had all of it, every word. Confession, motive, and the ugly, unrepentant heart of the man spoken aloud beneath the open sky. She looked at Dario, and she gave him the smallest nod, and Dario's mouth curved, not a smile. Something colder and older than a smile, Corrado, he said. The Corsi brothers send their regards. Belandi blinked. What? They've been listening, Dario said, the whole time. On the open line, in my pocket. Because I called them before we left the villa tonight, and I told them what I'd finally found proof of, about Palermo. About who exactly sent the police in 1991, his voice dropped low. You see, Corrado, the Corsi brothers had an uncle, in Palermo, a man who also went to prison that year on your word, on your betrayal, and died there, same as Tommaso, and for 30 years those two brothers have never known who to blame for it. A beat. They know now. The blood drained from Belandi's face. Because loyalty in that world was the only currency that never lost its value. And a man who had once sold a partner to the police had sold everyone. There was no crime worse. There was no crime the men of that world would forgive less. He had built his whole life on the secret. Ginevra had just pulled out of him into the open air, and in that moment he understood that the secret was out, and that it would not go back in. Headlights swept across the broken walls. Cars, 3 of them, grinding up the last of the hill and stopping, doors opening. Men stepping out into the moonlight. And at their head, unhurried, the 2 silver-haired Corsi brothers. Old money, old connections, and older grudges, kept warm for 30 years. And finally tonight, given a name to burn, Belandi's two men looked at each other. And then, slowly they stepped back from him, away from him, because they were paid to protect a powerful man, and the man in front of them had just stopped being powerful. Had just become, in the space of one confession, the most hated thing their world knew how to make. Belandi stood alone in the middle of the ruin. "Take the old woman," the elder Corsi said quietly, "to Ginevra, not unkindly. Go on. This has nothing to do with her. Or with you." Ginevra was already moving. Across the cold stone to the wheelchair, dropping to her knees in front of it, and taking the frail hands into both of hers. "Nonna," she breathed. "Nonna, I've got you. I've got you. It's over. You're safe." And her grandmother lifted one shaking hand and laid it against Ginevra's wet cheek, and smiled a real smile, a whole one, lit from somewhere deep. "You have your grandfather's fire," she whispered. "I always knew you did, even as a little girl. Even when you tried so hard to hide it away where no one would see." Her thumb moved slowly across Ginevra's cheekbone, wiping the tears. "Never hide it again, cuore mio. Do you hear me? Never again. Promise me that." "I promise," Ginevra said. "I promise, Nonna. Never again." Behind her, she heard the Corsi men close in around Belandi. She heard his voice rise, the first true fear in it now, sharp and high. She heard it fall, she heard a car door. And then she heard nothing at all. She did not turn around to watch. They took Assunta back to the hospice that same night. The doctor was furious when he understood what had happened, and then, checking her over inch by inch, he was astonished. Because the ordeal had not broken the old woman. If anything, it seemed to have poured something back into her. She was brighter than she had been in days. Stronger, like a woman who had been holding her breath for 40 years and had finally, in a ruined courtyard beneath the stars, been allowed to let it out. Ginevra sat at her bedside until dawn came gray, and then gold in the window, holding the frail hand. And this time, when her grandmother turned her head on the pillow and asked her about the man who had brought her home, Ginevra did not lie. She told her all of it. The office in Chicago, the folder, the flight in the night, the diary, Palermo, the debt. All of it from the first cold minute to the last. And her grandmother listened, without once interrupting, her hazel eyes steady on her granddaughter's face. And when Ginevra finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment, gathering something. Then she said, "Your grandfather saved his father's life. And now his son has helped to save mine." A faint smile touched her mouth. "The debt is paid, cuore mio. Both ways, at last. After all this time, after all these years." Her eyes found Ginevra's and held them. "It is finished. Do you understand what I am telling you? It is finished. And you are free. You are free." And Ginevra, who had spent her entire life running from one man, from one city, from her own reflection in the mirror, understood, for the first time in as long as she could remember, what it might mean to stop. Corrado Belandi's name never appeared in a single newspaper, but the recording found its way quietly into the right hands. And what the Corsi brothers did not handle in the old way, the law handled in the new one. His warehouses were opened. His empire came apart at the seams like a coat with the thread pulled. His allies scattered like rats off a hull already under the water. And the man himself, well, Ginevra never asked. Some questions are better left unasked. What she knew was this, that the man who had let her grandfather die in a cell for a crime that was never his, who had smiled at her over a plate of dessert, who had sent 3 men to carry a dying woman out of her bed in the dark, would never smile at anyone, ever again. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Her grandmother held on far longer than any of them had dared to hope. Not a week. Not 2, 4 months. 4 whole months of Tuscan mornings, of golden light coming in through an open window, of stories Ginevra had never in her life heard told. Stories of Tommaso, the real man, not the ghost, not the martyr in the cell, but the man. The one who sang badly and with total conviction. The one who loved fiercely and cried at weddings, and once traded a full week's wages for a ring he had no business affording, and gave it to a girl in a Palermo square, and never once regretted the hunger that came after. 4 months, too, of Dario coming to sit at the old woman's bedside. Not the man of the boardroom, not the man of the folder and the cold eyes in the shadow. Just a man younger somehow, at her bedside, gentler, holding the hand of a woman who had every reason under heaven to hate his family and his name, and who chose, instead, day after day, to forgive them. And on a soft morning in spring, with the window open and the smell of rosemary drifting up from the garden below. Assunta Fioravanti key closed her eyes and did not open them again. Her hand in Ginevra's, Dario standing quiet vigil at the door. They buried her in a small cemetery in the hills, where the cypress trees stand like sentinels along the wall, where you can see the whole of Florence spread out gold and hazy far below. Ginevra stood at the graveside a long time in the spring wind, and she was not alone, and she understood, standing there, that she would never have to be alone again. The night after the funeral, Dario found her out on the terrace. 2 glasses of wine between them on the stone rail, the Tuscan hills going black and silver under a rising moon. You could go home now, he said, quietly, not looking at her, looking out at the dark land. Chicago. Anywhere in the world you want. The debt is closed. My father's promise is kept. You owe me nothing. You never owed me anything, not really. If what you want is to walk away from all of this and go find your own life, far from any of it, I will make certain you can. I'll give you whatever you need to do it. And there it was, the door, open at last. For the first time since she had walked terrified into that little office in Chicago, the door stood open, and no one was standing in it. She could go. She could walk straight through it, back to the small, safe, invisible life. The knocking radiator. The job where nobody asked questions. The hollowed-out book with its run money, waiting on the shelf. Except she was not that woman anymore. She could not go back through the door and be her, because that woman no longer existed. She had steered a room of dangerous men with a single word. She had faced the man who murdered her grandfather and pulled a confession out of him beneath the open sky. She had knelt on cold stone in a ruined monastery and promised a dying woman that she would never hide her fire again. And a promise like that, once made, you keep. I don't want the world, she said. I've seen the world, Dario. I spent years trying to disappear into it. It's cold, and it's lonely, and there's nothing out there waiting for me that I want. She turned to face him. I want to stop running. That's the whole of it. That's everything I want. I just want to stop. Something moved across his face. On any other man, in any other light, she would have called it hope. My world is not safe, he said. You of all people know that now. Better than anyone. There will always be another Belandi somewhere. Another threat. Another compromise. Another night. I can't promise you how it ends. I know. I can't promise you a simple life. I never asked you for simple. She took a step toward him. I asked you for true. And he looked at her, this man who had crossed an ocean to close a dead man's account, and found, somewhere over the Atlantic, that the account had turned into something he had no name for and no defense against. Then stay, he said, and his voice was rough and low, and almost she had never heard this from him, not once, almost pleading. Not as an associate, not as a translator, not as a debt owed and paid. Stay as yourself, as mine if you'll be mine, if you'll have me. And Ginevra Fioravanti, who had run out of Chicago in the dark with one suitcase and a name that felt like a stranger's, stopped and chose. I'll have you, she said, and when he kissed her there on the moonlit terrace, with the whole gold weight of Florence sleeping in the valley below them, it did not feel like surrender. It did not feel like a chain going on. It felt, for the first time in all her running years, like coming home. But choosing a man was one thing. Choosing his world was another thing entirely, and she was not a woman who could love the one and pretend the other did not exist. She had translated the deals. She knew about the warehouses, the goods that moved at night, the money that went in dirty. She had never been naive, and she would not start now, so she began to ask questions, and Dario, to his lasting credit, never once lied to her. That had always been the strange truth of the man, a man who dealt in shadows, who kept his own counsel, who gave the world nothing it hadn't earned, and who never, not one time, lied to her face. What's really in those warehouses, she asked him one morning, over coffee, in the honest light of day. All of it. I want to know what this house is built on. You don't want to know, he said. I do. I'm not a doll you dress for dinner anymore, Dario. I'm the woman you asked to stay. If this house stands on something, then I want to know what I'm standing on, so he told her. And it was worse than she had feared, and it was better than she had feared, both, at once. Because some of it was exactly what the whispers in the Chicago freezer had said, goods that came in at 3 in the morning, money that needed washing, the old machinery of a world that had been running for 100 years before he was born, and would run for 100 after he died. But some of it she had not expected at all. Because Dario Ravena, it turned out, had been quietly trying to climb out of that world for years. My father built all of this on blood, he said, looking down at his own hands, on the debt, on what Palermo did to him. He couldn't leave it, it was all he had left, after your grandfather died in his place, his guilt and his empire. He held on to them both, like they were the same thing, like letting go of one meant letting go of the other. He looked up. But I never wanted it. I inherited it. There is a difference, and it is the whole of the difference in the world. Then leave it. He laughed without humor. You don't leave a thing like this, Ginevra. It leaves you. In a river. If you're careless, which is exactly what Belandi had planned for me. A pause. But you can do it slowly, carefully. You can turn dirty things into clean ones, one at a time, so patiently no one notices what you're doing. You can build something legitimate underneath the thing that isn't, until the legitimate thing can stand on its own. And then, one day, you pull the rot out from under it all at once. And what's left standing in the daylight is clean. She stared at him. That's what you've been doing, she said slowly, this whole time. Since before you ever met me, for 6 years, he said. And she understood at last what she had chosen. Not the monster from the whispers, and not a saint. Either she was too clear-eyed to make him a saint. Something harder to name and truer than both. A man born into a dark inheritance, who had spent 6 patient, dangerous years trying to drag it, inch by inch, into the light. And who had been doing it alone the entire time. Because in his world, trust was the one luxury that got you killed. And he needed help. He needed one person he could trust with all of it. Completely. And by the strangest accident in the world, across an ocean, over a phone call in Italian, answered at exactly the wrong moment, he had found her. Let me help you, she said. I've minored in finance, you know that. You read my file. I understand money. I understand people even better. I steered a whole room of your enemies with a single word and never broke a sweat doing it. You've carried this alone for 6 years because there was no one you could trust. Well, you can trust me. So let me help you get us both out. Together. He looked at her for a long, long moment. And then, slowly, he nodded. And that was the day their real partnership began. Not the beautiful woman at the dinner, the partner at the table. It took 3 years, 3 years of careful, patient, dangerous work. Because you do not simply walk away from an empire built in the shadows. The shadows have owners, the owners have expectations, and a man who tries to go clean becomes, overnight, a liability to every single person he ever did dirty business, with a loose end, a risk, a witness who might one day decide to trade what he knows for peace. Ginevra learned this the hard way. Because in the 2nd year, someone tried to kill Dario, not Belandi. Belandi was long gone by then, a name no one said anymore. This was someone new, an old associate of Dario's father, a man named Falcone, who watched which way the wind was turning and decided he would rather have a dead Ravenna. He could pick clean than a living one, who was going straight and making everyone around him nervous. It happened in Rome. A restaurant, late at night. Dario had gone to meet a man about selling off the very last of the shipping interests, the final thread. And Ginevra had insisted on coming because they were partners now, because she did not wait at home anymore, because she had made herself a rule the day she chose him. Wherever the danger was, she would be there too. Which was the only reason she saw it, because she was watching the room. She always watched rooms now, it was a habit deep in her body. Older than Dario, older than Florence. The waitress who reads every table the instant she walks in. And she saw the man by the door, the one who did not fit, whose hands stayed below the table when everyone else's were on it, whose eyes never once dropped to the menu in all the time he sat there. And she knew, the way she had known at a dinner 3 years before, that the name Belandi mattered before she had any reason on earth to think so. Dario, she said low, under her breath, not moving her lips. The door, gray jacket, get up. Now, and Dario, who had learned, over 3 years, to trust her instincts exactly as far as he trusted his own, got up. Immediately, without a question, without a glance, without a half-second's hesitation. Which was the only reason he was already on his feet, already moving, when the man by the door stood too. What happened after that happened fast, the kind of fast that only turns slow later. In the memory, when you take it out and hold it up to the light and see every frame, his men surging up from the next table. A shout, a chair going over, the bright, terrible crack of a shot. And Ginevra somehow, without deciding to, her body moving before her mind, hauling Dario sideways, behind a stone pillar in the half instant before the mirror, where his head had been shattered into 1,000 falling pieces. And then it was over. Falcone's man was on the floor, and Dario's people were on top of him, and Ginevra was pressed against cold stone, with her husband's arm locked around her like an iron band, and her heart was going like a hammer against her ribs, and there was glass in her hair. You saw it, Dario breathed against her temple, before it happened. You saw it coming, I always see it, she said, shaking. I've been seeing it my whole life, Dario. Every room, every door. I just never had anything worth watching for. Until you. Until now. He drew back and looked at her, and there was something in its face she had never seen there before, not desire, not even love, but something underneath both of those and older than both. It was awe. The plain, unguarded awe of a man looking at the person who had just kept him alive. That night back at the villa, she took the hollowed-out book down off the shelf, the one with the run money folded inside it. She had carried it from apartment to apartment for 6 years, from the old life, through Chicago, all the way here. Her escape hatch, her proof. Kept close, that she could always run again if the ground opened. She threw it away, because she was not going to run anymore. Not from anyone, not ever again. There was nowhere on this earth she would rather be than exactly where she stood, glass in her hair, her husband alive, her whole strange, dangerous, chosen life around her. By the end of the 3rd year, it was done. The shipping company sold, clean. The warehouses in Livorno emptied, legitimate, boring. The last dark thread cut and burned. And what stood in its place in the daylight was the thing Dario's father had chased for 40 years and never once caught, something honest. Vineyards that made real wine from real grapes. Restaurants, Ambrosia among them, the very place it had all begun, that made real money the real way. Land, and buildings, and an organization a man could put his own name on without flinching. That a woman could put her name on too, and the freezer stopped. Because there was nothing left anywhere to whisper about. Her daughter was born the following spring. They named her Asanta, for the grandmother who had forgiven a bold bloodline with her dying breath, who had looked her own kidnapper in the eye in a ruined courtyard and called him a coward, and won. She had her mother's hazel eyes, the Fioravanti eyes, passed down the line like the family's one true inheritance. And from the very first day, squalling and furious and magnificent, she had the fire too. You could see it plainly, and no one, Ginevra swore, watching her, no one would ever teach this child to hide it. Dario held her like she was made of spun glass and pure gold at the same time. This man of the boardroom, the folder, the shadow, the long cold years undone entirely, reduced to a father staring down at his daughter as though she had personally hung the moon in the sky for him. His own father had died guilty and afraid and alone in a house full of people who feared him. And his son, Ginevra, understood, watching them, would die someday surrounded, warm, loved, whole. Because the debt on that night in the courtyard had broken a chain, and not only the chain between two families, it had broken the chain inside Dario. The one that ran back through his father all the way to Palermo, whispering to him in his father's miserable voice that he did not, could not, would never deserve to be happy. That chain was broken now. The years folded into each other after that, the way years do. You don't notice them going. You notice a child's shoes that don't fit, a gray hair in the mirror, a morning when the house is quiet in a way it never used to be, and then you look up and a decade is gone, and you are someone you never once imagined you would get to be. Little Assunta grew up running barefoot through the same olive groves her mother had run through as a girl, the same silver-backed leaves, the same laughter carrying up the hillside in the gold of late afternoon. Except this time, no one was running from anything. That was the difference. That was the whole of the difference. When Ginevra watched her daughter run, she was watching a child who had never once in her life been afraid, who had never had to make herself small to fit between someone's moods, who ran simply because running felt good, and the world was wide and warm and safe, and nothing in it wanted to do her any harm at all. And once when the girl was 10, old enough to be handed something that mattered, Ginevra brought her up to the small cemetery in the hills, to the grave beneath the cypress trees with all of Florence spread out gold below. And she told her the whole story, the real one, about Tommaso, who died in a cell for a friend, about the debt that reached across an ocean and 40 years to find them, About a phone call and a folder and a photograph taken in a Palermo square in a year long before any of them were born. Her daughter listened, grave and still, the way children listen when they understand they are being given something to carry. And when it was finished, she was quiet a while, and then she said, "Great-grandfather Tommaso. He died for his friend, even though nobody made him, even though he didn't have to." A pause. "That was brave. It was the bravest thing I know." Ginevra said, "I want to be brave like that." And Ginevra knelt down in the spring grass and took her daughter's face in both her hands, and she felt the whole long chain of it running through her fingers. In that moment, Tommaso to Assunta the elder, to herself, to this child. Fire passed hand to hand, down the years and across the water and through all the dark, and never once let go of. "You already are," she whispered. "It's in your blood. It's in your name. All you will ever have to do, your whole life long, is never hide it. Promise me that." "I promise, Mama." The same promise, the same words, on the same hills. A third generation of women making the same vow to one another over the same unbroken fire. And Ginevra thought, kneeling there, of that first night. One last time. The cold coming off the lake, the wind that took whatever it wanted. 12 minutes late, and a phone she should never have answered, buzzing against her hip in a gold-lit room full of dangerous men. Because that was where all of it had begun, and she understood now what she could not possibly have understood. Then standing terrified in a little back office with a folder in her hands and a cold-eyed stranger reading her across a desk, that the worst night of her life and the best night of her life had been, all along, the very same night. That the thing she had been most afraid of had turned out to be the door standing open in front of everything she had ever wanted and never once let herself hope for. And that sometimes, if you are brave enough, if there is enough fire in you, if you refuse, just once, just one single time, to be invisible, the phone you are not supposed to answer turns out to be the one that finally, after all the running, all the years, all the long cold dark, calls you home.